My name is Nate Weisenberg, and I'm here with the Atomic Heritage Foundation. It is Thursday, October 12th, 2017, and I am here with Mr. Al Zeltmann at his home in Los Alamos. And my first question for you is if you could please say your name and spell it.
Well, my name is Alfred Zeltmann, Z-E-L-T-M-A-N-N. I've lived in Los Alamos for about 73 years. I came here as a GI in the Special Engineering Detachment, which was formed from various ASTP units during World War II. We were allegedly training to be officers, but at the time they needed technicians for the Manhattan Project. They were also pretty well satisfied with the number of officers they had, so they broke up the Army Specialized Training Program and sent a lot of us to various parts of the Manhattan Project. Let's see, I guess you'd like some of my background, where I started from. I was born and raised in a part of Brooklyn, Greenpoint. I was born in 1921, and as a result, my family and I lived through the Depression in New York, which was an unfortunate experience for all of us. About a quarter of the men in New York City were unemployed, and my father was one of those for a couple of years. I was fortunate enough to go to a very good high school, Brooklyn Technical High School, which had programs in chemical, architectural, civil, mechanical engineering, and I got an opportunity upon graduating to go to Cooper Union, which is a private endowment that gives a free education to people. So I worked during the day as a machinist and went to college at night. 4 evenings a week, you'd have 3 hours of college. I'd walk down from 23rd Street, where I worked in Manhattan, down to Cooper Union each night. And from 7 to 10 o'clock we had our classes, and then I'd go home. At the time, my family lived in Queens rather than Brooklyn, so it was a long subway ride. I'd get home about 11 o'clock, and then I could have dinner, which my mother made. I was drafted in 1942, and I went to an infantry unit, and they realized pretty soon that I wasn't fit for the infantry, and so I was sent off to Ohio State University to continue my college program, essentially. And when the Army decided to break up its specialized unit there, some of us were sent to Oak Ridge and some to Los Alamos and others to Pullman, Washington. So when I got here, it was a very pleasant atmosphere. The civilian scientists who were operating here were very solicitous of the GI's welfare, so that they were able to do a lot of good for us. So it was a very pleasant experience to live here. It was the Army, but the civilians were living here too. They had they constructed a lot of housing in short order here for the civilians, and the GIs, of course, lived in barracks, and the GIs did various things. Some of us who were staff members were able to continue functioning as research assistants, but some of the GIs actually had PhDs, so they were on a pretty good level, and actually were carrying out their own research. I was working on several projects which were critical to the production of a bomb, and so in the course of time I met Oppenheimer, who was concerned about a particular project we were on. So I got to meet him. I never met General Groves, although he presided on several ceremonies here in Los Alamos. It used to be that every time General Groves would show up here, they'd have a parade, and he'd award us a special award. There was a gold palm for our sleeve of the uniform. We used to call it the golden toilet seat, but he'd give a speech and we'd have a parade. Oppenheimer and Groves were my heroes, actually, for the Manhattan Project. Groves was important because even though he was a senior officer, he started out as a colonel, I guess, here in Los Alamos, but he kept his hands off the scientific work and let Oppenheimer do what he had to do to produce a bomb. He just provided the money and the equipment, and Oppie got along very well with the scientists and everyone, actually. He was a gracious man. I guess he could be stern with his equals at his scientific level, but he was generally pretty sympathetic to the GIs and their needs. Actually, the GIs may have been doing just as well as some of the civilians, because a sergeant like myself would be getting $100 a month of salary, and then also getting an allowance because I was married at the time. And civilians at that time would be doing very well to get $200 a week, and it was a lot easier for us with our 200 than it was for them. A lot of us used to go back to work at night because there wasn't much else to do. If we went to a movie, then we would stop off at the tech area and carry out some project. So people tended to work a lot more than 8 hours a day. They trying to get things done. I imagine we started out with a scientific staff, couldn't have been more than 300 or so, and it was several thousand by the time the war ended. In fact, I was in the first 150 GIs to come here, and by the time the war ended, there were 10 or 12 barracks with maybe 1,500 GIs here. Apparently the Army could supply any number of college students to, they didn't know what to do with otherwise. They sent them to a project like this. A lot of us weren't convinced that this was a place to live. Having come from big cities, not used to the West, but after a while it grows on you, and life, as they say, was relatively pleasant. You made your own entertainment. We played bridge in the barracks, and I suppose other people played cards and gambled. There was a battalion of WACs who here also, and so that the single GIs met girls here that they married. Let's see what else I could think of that might interest. We used to have colloquia on, I think it was Tuesday evening, in which Brad Oppenheimer would introduce a speaker and also note what progress had been made on the sticky issues in manufacturing a bomb. And then there'd be a speaker who would speak extensively on whatever project was of interest. Up front in these colloquia would sit all the present and future Nobel laureates. There'd be Teller and Feynman was here, a young fellow, just starting his career, and a number of other Nobel laureates. There was a quite elite group, and I can't imagine some of the people who had to give those colloquia, the younger scientists, in front of this very critical audience, but I guess it was a way of maturing. What else can I say? That after the war, they did manufacture some housing for the people who stayed on. There was some difficulty at the end of the war. A lot of the senior scientists wanted to go back to their universities and pursue their career, so they weren't sure that they could get enough staff to stay and continue the work. But a man named Norris Bradbury took over the leadership of the lab, and he was able to pull things together. They gave us very good salaries to stay here. In fact, I was making a lot more than most PhDs made immediately after the war. You wouldn't believe how cheap you could get a good scientist. In those days, $3,000 a year was a great salary. And of course, things expanded very quickly, but they were able to build the atomic bomb, for less than $2 billion. And the reason why people were getting dirt cheap salaries. But most of us would have been happy to work for a lot less, just to be involved with the work that we were doing. A lot of people after the war seemed to have expressed doubts about the morality of building an atomic bomb, but while we were here during the war, we realized that a lot of people were going to die unnecessarily if we didn't have, a lot of Americans at least. And so it was quite logical for us to want to make an atomic bomb in hopes to end the war earlier. I don't know what else to say. I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
So, picking up on the last point that you just made, when you got here, did you know what you would be working on?
Oh yes, there was never any doubt of what we were working on. As a staff member, when you came in, you were given something, a special report. It laid out exactly the size and amount of material that you were going to need for the bomb, and they even projected, I think, pretty much the exact yield of the first atomic bombs, something like 8 megatons, not 8 kilotons of explosive. That was the reason why there were white badges. The white badges were the people who came allowed to attend the colloquia. If you had a red badge or a yellow badge, you were excluded. We all had the same kind of clearance, but they just didn't want to distribute the knowledge too widely. But I don't think it was any secret. I think most of the wives knew what their husbands were doing, and you just didn't talk publicly about what was going on. There were incidents where I don't know how true they were. They said that packages were delivered to the atomic bomb project in Post Office Box 1663. So, that was one thing that was interesting here. Our mail was censored. What we would do was send our mail out unopened, unsealed, and the censor would read it, and if you didn't like what you said, he'd send it back to you. And the same way, coming in, your mail would be censored as well. We were allowed to tell our relatives where we were and that we couldn't reveal any information, but people knew where we were. An interesting experience I had, I went home to New York after the first atomic bombs had been exploded. And I was at the barber shop and telling the barber where I was, and he wanted to know how I liked living in a foreign country, and most people didn't know at the time where New Mexico was, I guess, and thought it was part of some other country. My wife in the earlier days was not allowed to be on the project, and so she sent a letter, and the censor noticed that she was complaining that I wasn't very warm in my letters, and the censor finally sent me a note. Tell her what she wants to know, which was pretty interesting. I guess they assign young officers to read the mail to censor them. What else? Daily life. The barracks was on the west end of Trinity, near the hospital, and the tech area was about a mile up the road, and we used to walk that back and forth every day. We had to come back to the barracks area for lunch, or the same way for dinner, and during the summer it had a tendency to rain about noon every day, and you'd have a fresh uniform on, and it'd get pretty soggy moving up and down that road. In the evenings, as I said, if you weren't going to a colloquium, you went to the movies. They're pretty cheap, 10, 15 cents, I guess. And, we saw all the pictures, and then of course they always had a military picture that you might listen to or watch. And warn you about venereal diseases and things like that. There was always one short film like that to go with the feature film, I guess. One of the favorite meals in the Army was tongue. Wasn't my favorite, but the chefs, they used to put out these long trays of beef tongue, in four rows. And during the war, there was a shortage of electricity, and the power would go out just about dinner time. And when the power went out, you found out when it came back on that you were sharing your meal with the cockroaches. So, but I didn't like the beef tongue anyway, so you could go up to the PX and you could get a steak and a salad for about $1 or $1.25. And so that was frequently what we did, some of us. Army food wasn't all that great. I guess it was nourishing, but I could have done them out without a lot of it. Can you think of anything else that might?
So when you were at Ohio State, what did they tell you about where you would be sent next?
Nothing. It was very interesting the way they got us all together, and they had a real old train, and they probably didn't use the main lines. They took us down to Oak Ridge on some the way the Army transported us. They were uncushioned seats on the train. They were just slats, and there would be three of us in two facing chairs, one facing two others, and we got down into Oak Ridge. They transported us in a bus with all its windows shielded, and they moved us into Oak Ridge, into a barracks, and I was there for about a month till they assigned us to Los Alamos. And then we came out on a very slow train from Oak Ridge. They took us up, instead of taking us directly, they took us up to Chicago because the brakes on the train were worn out and they had to fix them somewhat. And then we got from Chicago down to Lamy, and then because Lamy picked us up and delivered us to Palace Avenue down there in Santa Fe, and then we got another bus up here to Los Alamos. The train from Chicago to Los Angeles was called a California Limited or something like that, and it was frequently 24 hours late going through Santa Fe. So, but the Santa Fe is one of those capitals that doesn't have a railroad going through it, a passenger railroad. And so the closest place was a place called Lamy. I guess it's about 15 miles of Santa Fe. So they dumped us there, and there's just a station and a restaurant, I guess. And it was we were wondering what we were getting into when we were dumped down there in Lamy. I don't think Lamy has improved much over the years, but so we were very uncertain. Actually, they shipped us out here with about 30 GIs at a time. So, at the time, they assembled us in front of a big assembly building, which was in the center of downtown Los Alamos, where there are a couple of bank buildings now, and then at the time, I guess they hadn't finished the first barracks building, so we lived in 16 by 16 square shacks, tapered roofs, and standard army type of building you've probably seen in MASH. There wasn't, as I say, much entertainment. You could go to the PX and get a hamburger, and right now downtown there's a post office building, and right where that post office building is used to be a general store. And as you go farther down, there was the PX, where everybody went for, well, they did have a jukebox, so sometimes some of the GIs and WACs would be dancing, and you could eat. And then there was a gas station and a barber shop, and that was the extent of the center of town. Across the street from the general store was a military commissary where civilians got all their food. Obviously, everything else was military. It was either I forget what they call them, buildings that, assembly buildings where they used as a church on Sunday, and we used it for the colloquia, and all of these square, 16 by 16 square buildings along the main street. That was all that was there. They did eventually build some civilian housing to the north of Trinity. What else can I tell you?
Who were some of the people that you would work with?
Well, I worked with some people who were relatively famous here. Rod Spence was a group leader, and he and several others, like Gene Robinson, were working on the half-life of tritium. There wasn't much tritium around in the early days, but it's a rapidly decaying radioactive hydrogen which is used in bombs. And then my group leader was a man named Gerhart Friedlander, who was a very famous radiochemist. Friedlander and Kennedy wrote the primary book for radioactivity. In fact, two of my friends and I took the course that Friedlander gave up here for radiochemists, and we prepared the original notes for this book that became famous. Joseph Leary and Gordon Knobloch. Rene Presswood was a radiochemist who was very good at working with radioactive polonium. Polonium is a radioactive element which tends to get all over your lab. The recoil from the alpha particles drives the other radioactive material all around. So he was very good at working with without getting it all over the building. And let's see. I had a group leader later on named Joe Lemons, who was not famous, but he was one of the people I worked with. Eric Jetty, who was a professor of metallurgy at Columbia before the war, was an assistant division leader, and fortunately, I had gone to Cooper Union, and I had one of Eric Jetty's students, graduate students, was a professor there. So that gave me a sort of an in with Jetty, and I think it's made my life a lot more pleasant to have some attachment to the division leader. There was a Robert Kennedy was I think a co-discoverer of element number 94, and with Seaborg, who was in California. Never seemed, after the war, he went off to Washington University in St. Louis and became the head of the chemistry department there. I've never said, but my PhD is as a radiochemist, a physical chemist, but specializing in radiochemistry. And it is rather interesting that for a while after the war, everybody wanted to be a radiochemist. And and nowadays, my wife tells me that there's about only one school anywhere that's teaching radiochemistry anymore. I guess it's a kind of a difficult regime to set up in a university. So although I suppose they do radiochemistry all over the country, but not very concentrated. They still do a lot out at Berkeley on radiochemistry.
What was your first assignment when you got to Los Alamos?
Well, there was, as I say, we worked on a process called Zeltmann, which was a way of detecting small amounts of neutrons, since at the time really good neutron counters were not available, and they were only able to work with large numbers of neutrons. It was important to prepare initiators for the bomb that had a low neutron count, or none actually. If you tried to assemble a bomb with something that had neutrons in it, the thing would obviously start fissioning before you wanted it to. So it was important to get the neutron backgrounds down in these initiators. And I was working on a method of detecting neutrons in small quantities in order to refine the process of production so that we had no neutrons in the polonium to start with. I later on worked with a project called the RaLa project, which was a way of detecting or determining the critical mass that you would need for an atomic bomb. There were a number of competing methods attempting to determine what the critical size was, but ours was the most successful. It was called the RaLa project because it was radiolanthanum. If you have radioactive barium, which results from fission, then that barium decays and produces lanthanum-140, which is radioactive and which is a very intense gamma source. And you could put this gamma source in the side of a big sphere and detect gammas coming out. And if you observe the attenuation of those gammas as you imploded the sphere of uranium, you could determine how much compression you had. And once you knew that, you could decide what the size of the bomb had to be. And for that, von Neumann, who was a very famous physicist here, had been able to interpret these experiments. Upon determining the compression, he could then in turn determine what the critical mass had to be. So that was a very important part of the project, because obviously you wanted to use as little fissionable material, for obvious reasons, to make a bomb. Initial projections were for much larger spheres of uranium that you would need, and in fact impossible amounts. So as the calculations were refined, they found out they could do with a lot less, and that was what I was working on for about 9 months. After they solved the problem of the neutron background on the polonium, then I went over to this other project. And that's where I worked with Friedlander, who was so very famous. There's a very classical picture around. It shows a whack and a male scientist hauling a very heavy pot of metal around. And Norma Gross was the WAC, and she was a lieutenant in the WAC, and her husband was up here in Los Alamos. So she got pregnant, so she had to be retired. But the man in the picture is the very famous Gerhart Friedlander. He was a very fine gentleman. He and his wife were very solicitous of the GI's well-being. It was true of most of the civilian scientists. They looked out for us, you know. Can't think of much more.
So it sounds as if people got along pretty well.
Yes, they did. An interesting feature of the life here, the male scientists here, they were mostly male. There were a few women scientists, and as I say this, the WACs there was some PhD WACs here too, and the male scientists worked horrendous hours. Some of them just tried to make a 24-hour day out of it, and some of the GIs took advantage of the scientists' wives. It was just human, but that's the way it was. There was a laundromat of a sort over on Trinity as part of there were civilian houses up and down Trinity, and over towards the Omega Canyon, there was a laundromat where a lot of the ladies gathered and socialized. The civilians mainly socialized within their own homes. And of course, most of the GIs were excluded from that. It was just of course, Oppenheimer was famous for his martinis and his private parties. That would have been great to attend, I guess.
But you weren't ever invited to one of those?
No, I wasn't on that level at all. We all had our lives to lead, and the civilians were busy leading their lives. They had their families here, and apparently they developed a pretty good school system for the civilians. And, but you can imagine considering the way we lived in the barracks, you can see that there wouldn't have been all that socialization between the military and at least the Specialized Engineering Detachment, and occasionally we'd be invited, say, to Thanksgiving dinner or something with a civilian family, that sort of thing. But in general, there wasn't all that much mixture between GIs on my level. The officers might have been more privy to mix with the civilians.
You were a sergeant, is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tech 3, one stripe underneath. They were pretty generous with, certainly from the early times, with rankings for GIs. Normally it'd take you a lot longer, I guess, to get to be a T3 in the Army. They like to hold out those stripes for people re-enlisting, that sort of thing. Every once in a while, we'd get a commanding officer who wanted to make us more military. It was very hard to get technical people to be willing to perform the military aspects. So they attempt to take us out and drill us for march up and down, that sort of thing. But for the most part, they managed to put officers here who were just restrained themselves, and we didn't have to do much of a military sort. As I say, occasionally a colonel would come in here and want to have inspections in the barracks and that sort of thing, and it was usually a disaster. we were relatively unmilitary, I'd say. My wife was finally allowed to come to Los Alamos because my group leader needed a secretary, and she was a good secretary, so he managed to make sure that she got here. So we were able to live then, towards the end of the war, in a civilian dormitory. We had one dormitory room. And prior to that, my wife lived in Albuquerque, and she some wives lived in Santa Fe, but not many.
So she moved from New York to Albuquerque?
Yes, yeah. Well, she was an English girl whose parents emigrated to the United States, and I met her in Brooklyn. And of course, we were engaged when I was drafted, and we decided that she wouldn't come with me when I was stationed in Kansas. But it only took about 2 months to realize that we couldn't live without each other, and so we got married in Kansas, and I was in the 94th Division, the infantry division, as part of a combat engineers. Obviously, in the course of getting my PhD, my first wife wasn't interested in hanging around while I got my PhD, so we got divorced after about 7 years.
What was your first wife's name?
Audrey. She died 10 years or so ago, but we were friends afterward. It was a relatively friendly divorce.
Shifting gears a little bit, did you witness the Trinity test, or were you aware of what was happening at Alamogordo?
Yes, and that was one of the mistakes I made. I didn't go. It would have been relatively easy to arrange to go. Actually, I was in Albuquerque when the people were coming back from Alamogordo that morning after the bomb test, and we're all in a restaurant, and you could hear people talking about the results. Actually, some people went high up on the mountain and could see the burst of light from the shot. I guess down that way. A few people had their own personal cars up here, So occasionally the GIs could borrow a car and go down to Albuquerque. There actually was a bus that went down too you could take, but that had a schedule of its own. During the war, the roads weren't all that great, and the WACs would have to go down to meet a plane or to send some correspondence off, and they used to get down to Albuquerque in a very short time. And in those days, you had to go, there was no direct route to Pewaukee. You had to go down to Espanola and then go in. So it was an 8-mile triangle that you had to go through rather than just go straight to Pewaukee. The road to Albuquerque used to flood occasionally, and there were places where the railroad crossed the road, so the road dipped, and those would flood. You couldn't get through. That was true for well into the 50s before they fixed that up. So I guess they diverted the railroad.
Do you remember where you were when you heard about the bombing of Hiroshima?
Well, we knew it was about to be exploded. It was probably just a working day. We were in a lab. Nothing. Nothing remarkable particularly. It was another day. But I guess there was a general feeling of elation. It wasn't all that certain that a particular type of bomb was going to go off. The Thin Man was almost guaranteed to work, but it was never all that certain at the time that they hadn't had any experience except the one shot down at Trinity. As I say, after the fact, there were a lot of people who were having their doubts about whether it should have been used or not, but I think the general feeling of most of the civilians was it was a good thing. Certainly the GIs thought it was. We had hearing terrible tales of life in the Far East. I don't think any of us would have liked to have gone to Tokyo.
Did you know anyone who later turned out to be a spy or was involved in espionage?
Well, yes, I was in the, I didn't know them personally, but we had U-shaped barracks, and the center of that U were the showers and the bathrooms and what have you. So I was on one side of the barracks, and Green Glass was on the other side. I didn't know him. One of the reasons, he was a machinist and probably a red badge or yellow or something like that. But I knew people, I had good friends who were close to him in that barracks. He was. When I think back to that business of them executing the Rosenbergs, that is worse than exploding the atomic bomb over the Japanese. I think that at that time the Russians were our friends, presumably allies, and true, they were spies, but and what was further wrong, it seemed to me, was they used his wife to attempt to get him to be more responsive, and they executed her because she wouldn't be used. I thought that was awful. I used to see this fellow Fuchs, who was the English spy, and politically what Strauss did to Oppenheimer was just gross. We had a fairly large group of English scientists here during the war. Yeah, it's rather interesting. People like Fermi and Teller and so many others, even Einstein, were not Americans who provided a lot of his top scientists. It was Edward Teller had a very deep voice, and if you were in a restaurant, one time, even post-war, I can remember I could hear his voice and know immediately it was Edward Teller. And he was a great scientist, but his ego allowed him to really betray Oppenheimer. Well, there was jealousy there. Oppenheimer wasn't ready to make the super bomb, and Teller was, and it was always a question of who was a better scientist. And at that level, it's hard to compare them. They're all geniuses on a different level, on different areas. But Oppie was just personally popular, so that he was able to wring the best out of his whole scientific group. Yeah, there was another famous fellow here. Was actually George Kiszczakowski, who was a famous professor from Harvard, and I took a course from him in thermodynamics, and one of the things they always presenting is the fact that perpetual motion machines and infinite sources of energy just can't exist because of the second law of thermodynamics. But I remember one of the test questions, and when I was young, I was willing to give a patent to this guy who had this perpetual motion machine, but it didn't help my grade in thermodynamics. The GIs who were here, there was a post group, provisional engineers, and they were the military that kept security. They were from Kansas. There was the only cavalry still left in the army, I guess, and they didn't exercise their horses enough, so the civilians were able to go down on a Sunday and get a horse to ride around to get some exercise for the horses, which was fortunate for people who liked to ride horses. We had a couple of people killed in the time I was here. A fellow in our group was from Kentucky and had a big bay horse, which he rode. And apparently the thing got frightened, the horse, and raced down the canyon, and this fellow got knocked off, died from concussion, I guess. I got a lot of radiation from this radiolanthanum. There were a group of us who got many, many times the dosage, within thousands of times the radiation they'd allow people to get today. And, but the Army Surgeon General came by and asked how much radiation we were getting. We told him, and he said, "Well, soldier, this is war," and which it was. But nowadays, the amount of radiation that people are allowed to get is just trivial. Probably not as bad as cosmic radiation. Things have changed a lot. And of course, before the war, the women were painting watch dials with radium and licking the brushes. I guess they didn't have very long lives.
Have your thoughts or reflections on working on the Manhattan Project, have they changed at all over time?
I don't think they've changed very much. As a GI who didn't want to go to Japan, I certainly thought it was a great idea to drop the bomb. The people were very unyielding. There was a lot of talk about how they should demonstrate the weapon. Well, first of all, that was impractical because there wasn't that much fissionable material ready at the time. I think they only had one more bomb on the way at the time of the surrender, and I'm not sure that it would have made a difference. You always debate the morality of killing people. People wonder whether we would have used it on the Germans as we were willing to use it on the Japanese. That's an interesting point. We always have these biases. I've generally been pretty well biased against the Japanese because I was drafted out of college and had to give up 3 years of my life to the Army. I profited by it in the long run, but it wasn't anybody's intention to make my life better.
And you stayed in Los Alamos after the war.
Yes, I went. I had a senior year of college to do. I mostly took graduate courses, and then I went down to UNM to get a PhD. I got my PhD with a man named Milton Kahn, who was working for Emilio Segre during the war. And his wife actually had a lab down the hall from mine. And he was already a radiochemist. It was very convenient, but the problem going to school at that time in New Mexico was that the chemistry department didn't have many courses to offer on the graduate level. So I had to take a lot of my courses in physics and mathematics. We were pretty cavalier about radioactivity shortly after the war, and we were trying to measure something called the half-thickness of these lanthanum gammas in air, several hundred meters, I guess. So what we did was get a meteorological balloon, and we put a very large source of radioactivity under that balloon. And we had the security guards on either side of the canyon ready to shoot it down if it got away. Unfortunately, a rain squall came along and plummeted that balloon right down in among all the scientists. And it was a really big radioactive source, so we all scattered. But the danger was just fantastic. We were lucky. We had sealed off the compartment and the platinum container, actually, and when it hit the ground, it didn't spill any radioactivity out through the squeezed opening, and but it was really terribly dangerous. Yeah, that was one thing we did. That was, in those days, early on, we weren't afraid of the radiation the way people are today. And actually, it was just down this canyon from actually goes into the main road. When you go down that canyon, you'll see some buildings off to the left, and that's the end of Bio Canyon, which is very famous in Los Alamos lore, because that's where we used to prepare these very intense radioactive sources. What would happen was every 2 weeks a shipment of radioactive barium, which they had prepared at Oak Ridge, would be sent to Los Alamos in one of these massive lead pigs. And we would let the radioactive lanthanum grow into the barium, and then the process was separating the radiolanthanum from the barium, and this is what we used to put inside these massive 5,000-pound shots of lenses of explosive, which we were using to determine the critical mass. And but as I say, it was real close to. Of course, none of these houses were in this area at that time. It wasn't until much later that they opened up. When was it? 60 or so. They finally started selling the old houses that the AEC owned, and allowing us to buy lots to build our own houses. Incidentally, I built this house myself. I did about 70% of the work that's involved in it.
Was there a story about a burro and a guy named John Rodriguez?
Oh, yes, I did that, yes. John was a chemist who was working with beryllium, and unfortunately he was one of the first casualties of Los Alamos. I don't know, he got beryllium poisoning, but I don't know whether he got it here or whether he got it at I think he was at.
I think it was here.
Yeah, beryllium was another bad element to work with, and in any case, there are reasons for wanting to use low atomic weight materials in a bomb, and he worked with beryllium, and but the story about the burro was he had a stable and he had some horses and he had a burro, but the horses weren't very good at doing their business in the stable, and the burro trained the horses to go outside. That was certainly true. This fellow was named John Rodriguez. He was a bright young fellow. It's just unfortunate. I think he had worked on beryllium at Brown University. Yes, he probably worked on beryllium there, and they used his talents here. But, it was really sad because his wife and his brother were heard to be figuring out what they were going to do with the $15,000 that the government had generously awarded them because of his death. But that's just a sidelight on the, There were a lot of impromptu arrangements, like having a stable for a few horses. This was down in the Omega Canyon, where they actually had a couple of reactors over time. They had a fast reactor down there, and they had one where when I was doing my PhD, I did it with the radioactive iodine. It has an 8-day half-life. And I was studying how the iodine exchanges with the thyroid gland. And to get this radioactive iodine, you put tellurium into a pile, a reactor, and irradiate it with neutrons. And the neutrons on tellurium produce radioactive iodine. And I use this radioactive iodine to study rates of chemical reactions. It's called exchange reactions. And they also had something called a water boiler, which was just a solution of uranium nitrate originally, and you get enough uranium nitride with the tampers around, nitrate with tampers around, and you have a controlled nuclear fission. And they called it a water boiler. And during the war, they decided that they didn't want to use the nitrate because nitrate tends to decompose. So they brought that solution up to my lab, and they reprocessed it into sulfate. So then, or perchlorate, I don't know which, but here again is a situation where in a relatively open lab amongst a lot of chemists, they processed fission elements. That certainly has changed.